out running around in the woods or helping in a cemetery.
Right, cemetery has been your big focus, hasn't it? Okay.
Yes. Right. So my name is Megan Coppage, and I have lived here in Clay County for almost 30 years. When we first moved to Clay County in the mid-90s, it was not uncommon to find cows wandering through our backyard off 220. I've always been fascinated by nature and history. After my daughter was born in 2022, I began hiking to stay grounded and achieve a consistent work-life balance, which we all know how hard that can be. As I began hiking more and becoming involved in local historical societies, I realized that many of our parks and conservation areas preserved more than just plants and animals. Most, if not all, protect our county's cultural landmarks and heritage sites. For me personally, knowing the historical significance behind these beautiful places makes it that much more enjoyable and appreciative to hike. Okay. Clay County has roughly 150,000 acres of conservation land, even though I know that probably doesn't seem like it. But this map on the right is from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, which is Florida's primary database for tracking conservation land. For parcels to be considered conservation land, the land must be undeveloped and in its natural state. Almost half of Clay County's conservation lands are owned and managed by Camp Blanding, which you can see this giant green, almost rectangle triangle there, up there surrounding Kingsley Lake. But Clay County is also home to one state park, 2 state forests, and multiple preserves and parks that offer a variety of recreational options. In this presentation, we will be exploring 5 exceptional parks from Middleburg to Green Cove Springs and the history behind those places. Florida has a record-breaking, award-winning state park system with over 4 million visitors in 2025. It is one of the most heavily used park systems in the entire United States. Florida began dabbling with the idea of a state-governed park system in the 1920s, but there wasn't really any extra money at the time to buy land and construct public recreation areas. Florida's state parks started in earnest thanks to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and the Civilian Conservation Corps. With the creation of the CCC in the 1930s, Florida began seeking to take advantage of the program and, most importantly, the funding that it provided. Florida relied heavily on land donations to begin its state park system, and Jacksonville businessman and developer Mike Race donated land for Gold Head. By 1936, the state park system comprised of 7 units built by the young men employed by the CCC. Gold Head is Clay County's only state park and one of the oldest in the state of Florida. 19 of the 23 original CCC structures still stand in the park today, including the Lakeside Bathhouse, the Ranger Station, and some of the cabins. Our state parks provide some of the best amenities in the country. Gold Head has your standard RV and tent camping, but it also provides cabins as well. I actually have friends that will drive up from South Florida a few times a year just to come to Gold Head and unplug. These cabins start around $65 per night, which is cheaper than Lake Motel 6. Many people do not realize that Clay County is also home to quite a few different ravine systems. These steep head ravines are rare in Florida and are usually only found in the North Florida Panhandle. Gold Head Branch protects the largest ravine system in Northeast Florida. Gold Head offers a rare chance to actually go down into one of these sensitive ravine systems if you're up for walking up and down about 4 flights of stairs. According to an updated management plan, the park is going to work on making the ravine ADA accessible in the future. So one day while I was at Gold Head, I started talking to a gentleman who had lived most of his life in Middleburg. He told me that as a child, they would actually hold nuclear attack drills during the Cold War. And during those drills, they would have everyone at the schools load up on buses and they would drive to Gold Head, where they would shelter in place in the ravines in case of an attack. Looking back, he was laughing and he told me, you know, he didn't think that they would actually be protected from any kind of fallout, but that's what they thought what would happen. Goldhead also protects 23 acres of sinkhole lakes. These 3 sinkhole lakes are direct connections to our aquifer. Shealer Lake takes the distinction for being one of the oldest lakes in Florida by being almost 24,000 years old. Scientists and biologists were able to date the lake by carbon dating pollen found at the bottom of the lake. Shealer was once open to the public for swimming and diving, but extensive erosion caused the park to close the lake in the 1980s. However, there is a short trail that you can take to the lake's edge today. Right? The National Park Service, along with local government entities and nonprofits, manage 11 national scenic trails throughout the United States. These national trails are often hundreds of miles in length and showcase natural and historic landmarks along public lands. Examples of these trails include the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail. Florida is very lucky to have its own trail, the Florida National Scenic Trail. The Florida Trail is a 1,500-mile-long trail that runs across the state from Fort Pickens National Monument in Pensacola down to Big Cypress in the Everglades. If you have ever been driving around the state and seen a sign with bright orange blazes, then you have come across the Florida Trail. Goldhead Ranch is one of the few state parks that has a segment of the Florida Trail. The Florida Trail cuts through Goldhead for about 5.5 miles. And if you head south out of Goldhead, you'll head into Putnam County, and if you head north, you'll eventually make your way to Bradford. Between January and April is the hiking season in Florida, and it is not uncommon to see groups of hikers hiking through Keystone Heights. Since its designation as a national trail in 1983, only a little over 500 people have actually officially completed the Florida Trail. In comparison, about 2,000 people complete the Appalachian Trail each year. I'm hoping that within the next 5 years, I will be able to add my name to that list, if I can take off work for that long. So there is one last little tidbit of information I wanted to add about Goldhead before we move on to our next park. The Old Mill site is the trailhead for the Loblolly Loop Trail, a mile-long nature trail that takes it around, you guessed it, an Old Mill site. The Glisson family actually lived on the shores of Lake Johnson and operated a sawmill, grist mill, and cotton gin starting in the 1880s. Charity Hall Glisson remembered the wood being sawed there for the old Gadara Baptist Church, which actually met at the mill for a time after the mill closed. According to church elders, who are unfortunately long gone, 2 people were actually buried in the vicinity of the old mill site. The CCC actually tried to reconstruct the mill site in the 1930s when they were building the park, but unfortunately it could not be saved and it was actually demolished. Charity also remembered an itty-bitty train that would bring supplies in and haul cotton and lumber out. This would be a spur train for the Green Cove and Melrose Railroad. So how did Goldhead get its name? Charity swore that during the Indian Wars, there were 2 men making their way to Melrose carrying gold for payroll. They ended up getting ambushed by Indians. One of the men was chased into the ravine and his body was later found. Rumors say that they buried the gold at the head of the spring, but no one's ever found it. And just a heads up, the rangers ask that nobody goes out there and tries digging for the gold. They appreciate that. So what do Indian Mounds, Spanish-era highways, and the Seminole Wars have in common? Baird Point Conservation Area. Another large group of public lands in the state of Florida are managed by the state's 5 water management districts. These districts focus on preserving and protecting the state's water resources. Baird Conservation Area is a 10,000-acre tract of unspoiled land south of Green Cove Springs that protects 5 miles of shoreline on the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River in Clay County is heavily influenced by ocean tides and Bayard protects the floodplain of the river, thus providing natural flood control. 4,000 of Bayard's 10,000 acres are wetlands. Conservation of the Bayard area began in 1992 when J.P. Hall's family sold several parcels of land to the district. In case you didn't know, J.P. Hall was sheriff of Clay County for 37 years. His son, Junior, also held the position of sheriff, and he was well known for his philanthropy and ongoing endeavors such as the J.P. Hall Children's Charities and Christmas Party. The history of Bayard dates back to 10,000 years ago, with Native American mounds once dotting the shoreline. Bayard protects two prehistoric burial mounds that are on the Florida Master Site File. The self-proclaimed archaeologist C.B. Moore completely excavated these mounds in the 1890s. Fun fact, Moore actually stayed at the Magnolia Hotel in Green Cove while exploring and recording many of the mounds in Clay County. I will point out that many of the artifacts that C.B. Moore found and excavated from these mounds ended up either sold to private collectors or they ended up in museums in New York and Washington, D.C. So right outside of the conservation area on private land lies the remnants of Fort San Francisco de Pipo, which I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
It's right.
Really? Oh,
Isn't
nice.
she-
Pupo.
Yes.
Pupo.
Yeah.
And this fort, along with Fort Picolata across the river, was instrumental for protecting the interior of Spanish Florida from pirates and English raiders. Its usefulness as a fort didn't last very long, but it was a major ferry crossing and stopping point on the El Camino Real, a Spanish-era highway that linked St. Augustine to Pensacola. Starting in the 16th century, the El Camino Real was a major thoroughfare for trade and religion throughout Spanish Florida. Soldiers and friars would actually load in their boats at Fort Picolata, come across to St. John's, they would get off at Bayard, and then they'd continue west through Clay County onto Gainesville and other Spanish mission sites. There have not been any confirmed Spanish missions in Clay County, but there was probably a Timucuan Indian village near this site. The Bellamy Road, Florida's first federal highway, was actually built upon and followed the old Spanish mission routes. And the Bellamy Road still actually exists in Clay County today. And this map up here is an 1837 map of Florida published by J. Lee Williams. You can see an area on the map marked Bayard. This was General Duncan Clinch's land grant during the Seminole Wars, and he named it Bayard after his son. He was actually planning to build a town in that area, but the Seminole Wars stopped any future development. So Bayard is bordered by highways 16 and 17 and is dissected by 209 South. The property is divided into 4 sections and has multiple entrances and trailheads. The main parking lot is off State Road 16. It is kind of hard to find right now because of the construction of the First Coast Expressway and the bridge, but it is there if you can find it. The 3 other main sections of Bayard are primarily used for hunting because they're in the swamp and the mosquitoes are unreal. Don't ask me how I know that. One of the focal points of Bayard is the observation tower, which was built to overlook a population of a rare native plant species. The observation tower is about a 2-mile round trip from the trailhead. Bayard also offers primitive camping along with a campsite right on the St. Johns River. Camping is free, but reservations must be made through the Water Management District. Water management lands offer passive recreation, which means you will not find any amenities at Bayard. Bayard is lucky enough to have a compost toilet, and that is it. Okay. So, Black Creek Ravines Conservation Area actually lies directly east of historic downtown Middleburg, and it's also managed by the St. John's Water Management District. The property was bought and preserved in 1996. It protects up to 2.6 miles of Black Creek and boasts an incredible mile-long ravine system that is actually up to 95 deep in some places. These ravine systems are created when rainwater soaks into porous ground, often sand, until it hits a layer of rock and clay. Since it can no longer move downward, it begins moving laterally until it erupts or seeps out of the side of a hill or slope. These ravines, slopes, and springs are very fragile environments and are actually closed off to the public at Black Creek Ravines, but you can see good examples of this process at Gold Head and the Ravine Gardens in Palatka. So since Black Creek Ravines is located so close to the Middleburg Historic District, it has to have a lot of history. The earliest Spanish land grant on record in the Black Creek area was given to John Fontaine in 1816, who later sold the property to Gabriel Priest in 1823. Gabriel was one of Clay County's earliest pioneers, and the Brandings were actually his neighbors to the east. Priest was involved in local affairs and politics, serving alongside Zephaniah Kingsley and Lewis Fleming. Gabriel's land grant is essentially contained within the ravines today. Clay County was an interesting place during the Civil War. Florida did not see as much action as other southern states during the war, but Tallahassee was the only southern capital east of the Mississippi not to fall to the Union. Florida was important for providing meat, salt, and other resources to the Confederate Army as many other states began to fall to the Union. Magnolia Springs was a Union base for the latter half of the war due to its proximity to Jacksonville and being on the St. Johns River. Jacksonville was captured and occupied about 3 times during the Civil War, so it was pretty much a Union stronghold. From Magnolia Springs, they would lead raids into the interior of the county towards Middleburg. Remember, at this point in time, Middleburg was a major port for transporting cotton and other goods due to being on Black Creek. Black Creek was a direct route from the St. Johns River to the interior of the state. In the ravines area, you will find bluffs up to 30 feet high along the creek, which made for perfect lookouts for both armies. Civil War trenches can actually still be found in the area today, including this one along the spur trail on the southeastern side of the park. Be forewarned that most of the trails of the Black Creek Ravines are in full sun, no shade. So to walk along the creek and out to the Civil War trenches, it's about a 4 to 5 mile round trip walk. Okay. So one of the most special highlights about this property is its ecological diversity. Black Creek Ravines is home to about 15 different natural communities, including sandhill, swamp, oak hammock, and pine flatwoods. These different communities provide homes for almost 1,000 different species of plants and trees. One in particular is the rare and elusive Bartram's Ixia, which is actually named after William Bartram himself. Bartram originally discovered the plant in Volusia County and wrote about it in his 1774 book, Travels. Only growing in 7 counties in northeast Florida, this plant is actually so rare that after Bartram wrote about it, it wasn't rediscovered until the 1930s. The flower only blooms for a few hours each morning in the spring, and it is heavily dependent on fire to bloom. Black Creek Ravine supports a healthy population of this plant. And then Florida is also home to a dozen species of carnivorous plants, which is more than any other U.S. state. The ravine provides exceptional habitat for at least half a dozen species of these plants. Unfortunately, some of these species are threatened and endangered due to habitat loss and poaching. And the hooded pincher plant and the sundew, those are the examples of the carnivorous plants that we have around here. Okay. And these are a few more interesting plants that can be found at the ravines that are actually blooming right now. The red plant is known as coral bean or cherokee bean. It is highly, highly toxic to humans and pets. And I've actually found out doing a lot of research, 50% of like Florida's plants can kill you. You might not know it, but a lot of them are very dangerous. But even though it's toxic to humans, somehow the Cherokee Indians and the Creek Indians actually use this plant for medicinal purposes. Please don't try that at home. Netted pawpaw in the middle is a larval host for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So the pawpaw plants, they actually produce a fruit in the spring and summer, and you can actually turn it into a jam. That is, if you can beat the animals to it. And this beautiful plant on the right, this is one of my favorite plants. This is the sandhill milkweed. It is an important host for the monarch butterfly, and Florida has about 20 native species of milkweed, and they're all as pretty as that one. All right, let's head to Belmore State Forest. I didn't even know Belmore existed until about 3 or 4 years ago. I had no idea that we had a second state forest in Clay County. So the Florida Forest Service currently manages 38 state forests and 1 ranch, totaling over 1 million acres, which is awesome. Our state forests offer just as much recreation as our state parks do, including camping, hiking, fishing, and hunting. One of the main differences between state forest and state parks is that many state forests are open seasonally for hunting, while state parks are not. Clay County is home to 2 state forests, Jennings and Belmore. Belmore is one of the newer state forests, and acquisition began in 2004 with Florida Forever funding. 2 distinct tracts cover over 12,000 acres near the intersections of 16 and 21. Like the ravines, Belmore is vital for protecting the Black Creek watershed by conserving land along its tributaries. Since Belmore is a newer forest, it is not as developed compared to Jennings. But I have noticed in the past 5 years or so that the rangers and volunteers have been hard at work setting up trails, pavilions, and recreation areas throughout the forest. The Satsuma Track is adjacent to Camp Landing and the Clay County Outdoor Adventure Park. Camping isn't available in the Satsuma Track, but it hosts many valuable events like Operation Outdoor Freedom, which is a hunting event for wounded veterans. There are established hiking and equestrian trails on the Satsuma Track. The Addis Creek Track, the bigger of the 2, is very popular with the Jeep community and has multiple trailheads and recreation areas. The Addis Creek is very easily accessible. You can actually drive into that forest versus Satsuma where you have to park and walk in. And many of the roads throughout the forest are well taken care of. I had a 2014 Chevy Cruze, and I mean, I could get around the forest very easy. And if you've seen a Chevy Cruze, they're kind of like low to the ground, and she did really good. And the next one, please. All right. Although Belmore tends to be lesser known than its sister state forest, Jennings, the area has a lot of fascinating history, beginning with the 1880s Florida land boom. Belmore Land Company, which that's a brochure for them right there, they were actually based out of Chicago, but they bought 4,000 acres in southern Clay County and began advertising the magical Belmore City, where riches were to be made. They ran ads all over the county, charging as little as $3 for a single lot. The Green Cove Springs and Melrose Railroad line actually made it to the city in 1886. Similar cities popped up on the railroad line, such as Wilderness and Sharon, but the Great Freezes in the 1890s put a stop to any future development. Also, there were a ton of lawsuits when people bought this land without coming and actually checking it out first, because you know, it's the 1880s. They can't just drive back and forth or fly back and forth. So when they actually got to Belmore and saw the land that they had bought, and it was pine forests, not orange groves, and you know, this like tropical, beautiful beach, you know, they were pretty upset. But after the freezes in the 1890s, a lot of farmers actually moved south, and then the railroad, the Green Cove and Melrose Railroad line, was abandoned in 1899. So that pretty much put a stop to any future development. So Belmore may not have had orange groves, but it did offer valuable replacements: turpentine and camper trees. Turpentine was a hot commodity in Clay County, especially after the Great Freezes wiped out everybody's agricultural harvest. Turpentine is actually why you will find no old growth pine trees in Clay County. Entire forests were completely cut down and cleared by the 1930s. It's not uncommon to find remnants of the industry in almost any surviving pine forest today. Hurdy cups were actually clay pots used to collect the sap from the trees. The sap from these trees were used for a variety of purposes, including medicine and to waterproof wooden ships. So turpentine was a brutal industry. OSHA would have an absolute field day today if it was still around. The camps were often in the middle of nowhere, no electricity, no running water, no phones. They were usually very dangerous and full of violence, and it was not uncommon to find a cemetery adjoining the camps. So as the employment pool dried up, where do you think the companies turned to? And that was convict labor. It was pretty common to have chain gangs out in rural Clay County at the turn of the 20th century. So, and this is a sad story I found out while I was researching this. Laura Lane Weeks was the sister-in-law of Clay County Sheriff James Weeks. She was actually murdered in 1911 by one of the convicts that escaped from the Belmore convict camp. She did not die in vain. Her death helped eventually ban the use of convict labor in these private camps. Okay. Right. Around the same time frame, the area that would become the Satsuma tract of Belmore was covered in thousands of camper trees, a tree native to Japan and Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, we would not realize how invasive these plants were and detrimental to our natural ecosystems until decades later. But after World War I, the United States realized that it could no longer trust or depend on Japan for camphor, and camphor was a very important ingredient in making gunpowder. It was also costing the United States millions of dollars per year importing this plant. So companies began looking for alternative locations to grow the trees here in the U.S., and Florida had a similar climate that would be able to support the trees. So after a successful farm was started in Putnam County, this is where the DuPont company comes into play in Clay County. They actually purchased 11,000 acres in Clay County for $6.5 million in 1916. This actually became one of the largest business deals in the state of Florida at that time. And DuPont planted over 2,000 acres worth of trees. However, industry is a funny thing, and it is constantly evolving. By the time the trees at the camper tree farm were matured and ready, DuPont scientists had actually found a cheaper way to make synthetic camphor, so the farm was shortly abandoned afterwards. So camphor trees are now classified as a Category 1 invasive species, which means they have escaped cultivation and outcompeting natural plants and disrupting natural ecosystems. My hat's off to the Forest Service, because I mean, they have had to go into Belmore and take out thousands of these plants. You very rarely see them today. Funny enough, we actually had a camphor tree growing out in front of the Clay County Historical Society and Museum. I actually went to go take a picture of it for this presentation and realized that they had finally cut it down. It is no longer there. In case you're wondering, it was the tree that was by the time capsule in the corner of the property, but it's no longer there. So, right, on to Jennings State Forest. Jennings is probably the most popular outdoor recreation area in Clay County. The forest stretches over 25,000 acres from Middleburg all the way up into Duval County. I know last month's presentation featured Beth Smith from Jennings State Forest and on May Jennings, so we will focus on the far east side of the forest off Live Oak Lane. There are two trailheads off Live Oak Lane, the Sand Ridge Trail Complex and the Fire and Water Trailhead. So So the Florida Forest Service actually has this amazing program for hikers and equestrians called the Trail Walker Program and the Trail Trotter Program. And I have done this. I'm an overachiever, so I've pretty much done the whole program. For every 10 different trails hiked or ridden in at least 5 different state forests, you actually get a completion certificate from the Florida Forest Service, and they send you like special swag, like water bottles, keychains, bumper stickers, patches, if you collect patches. There are multiple levels to complete, and each level comes with a variety of prizes. Best of all, it's free and it's open to all ages and all fitness levels, and they keep track of everything for you on their online portal. Jennings State Forest has almost 10 trails to choose from, the most of any state forest on the list. One of those trails is the Fire and Water Trail, a 2-mile interpretive nature loop. The Fire and Water Trail is one of the oldest trails at Jennings State Forest, and my first time hiking it was actually 15 years ago. In college, when a friend and I felt that we had learned enough for the day, we would go run off to Jennings to decompress. And Kristen, thank you for being crazy enough to go hiking with me on sketchy back roads when we were younger. She was my only friend that would go with me. So the Fire and Water Trail takes you through the forest and explains how water, wind, and fire have shaped Florida for tens of thousands of years. If you didn't know, Florida's ecosystems are heavily fire dependent, and many of our plants and trees need the fire and most importantly, the heat to produce seeds and germinate. That's one of the reasons why gopher tortoises are protected. They are a keystone species, and their barrows provide shelter for over 300 different animal species. During times of fire or wildfires, these barrows also help protect other animals.
Are those cypress trees in that far right? Above?
Yes.
I've
Yes,
never
so
seen
that's
a
actually,
knee like that.
so that's, that is actually a dome swamp. And you'll find like these weird little swamps like out in the middle of the pine forest. And I actually took that picture about a month ago, and I have never seen it that dry. I have never seen the swamp so dry. So that is kind of the one cool thing about the drought, is that I've been able to get into places that you normally can't get, because usually the water is up to my knees in there. And there is also a bull alligator that supposedly lives in there, so I won't go in there in the water either. Right. So Jennings is also home to half a dozen historic cemeteries. I can't do a presentation without mentioning cemeteries, as y'all notice. One of those is actually the Bell Cemetery, which dates back to 1902. The Bell family were one of the earliest Florida frontier families. Daniel Bell and his brother were the first settlers that came to Hamilton County, which is near the Florida-Georgia border, in 1824. They were supposedly guided by an Indian chief down the Alapaha River. Daniel's children were the first white settlers born in the county. Daniel's son, Daniel Jr., moved east to Middleburg in the 1860s into the area that is now Jennings State Forest. Daniel took advantage of the 1862 Homestead Act, which granted settlers 160 acres for free if they lived and improved their lots for 5 years. Briefly taking a pause during the Civil War to fight for the Confederate Army, Daniel survived the war and returned to his land afterwards. Daniel and his wife raised almost a dozen children in the backwoods about 10 miles north of downtown Middleburg, and it was not an easy life. The soil was actually really poor. It was really sandy. The area was prone to floods, being near Black Creek and a lot of its tributaries, but the Bells were a hardy bunch. Daniel was the first member of the family to be buried at Bell Cemetery in 1902. So there was actually a small community called Bell at the turn of the century. They had a school, and they later had a church. One of the reasons you won't see Bell mentioned a lot on a lot of maps is because Bell was not on a main railroad line. So that's why it never showed up on a lot of maps. The Bell School was deeded to the county in 1905 by Daniel's widow, Hattie. And you can see in this 1918 USGS topo map, you can actually see Bell School near Mill Creek. There was also a Baptist church called Mill Creek Baptist that met in the area for 5 years from about 1920 to 1925 before it became defunct. Some records found different things, and I know you guys understand this, especially like when you're doing research. So I read some places that the church had in the school after the school closed down, but then I also read that the church had actually its own building, but regardless, they were wooden, so they ended up burning down. Let's see. So some of the Bells, they're fed up with the land. They're fed up with it. So they ended up moving into Duval County in the search for better land, and others, such as James Washington Bell, stayed to raise cattle in the forest. And I'd like to thank Craig Bell for providing me with the history of his family in the following pictures. This photo is of Anna Laura Godwin Bell with her daughter and grandchild at Mill Creek in 1931. And she was married to James Washington Bell, pictured on the right, and they are both buried at Bell Cemetery. So Florida became a hotbed of activity after World War I and leading up into World War II. With the abundance of undeveloped land, Clay County had quite a few bombing ranges and bases, and most importantly, we had Camp Landing. Some of the Bell family actually lost their homes when the state used eminent domain to begin building Cecil Field. Craig's great-grandparents had moved from Mill Creek to the area that became the Yellow Water Gunnery School at Cecil Field, and that was actually their home before it was absorbed into the base. James Washington Bell, still living south in Jennings State Forest, ended up leasing 120 acres to the U.S. Navy for a practice bombing range called the Bell Target during the spring of 1943. Another 480 acres were actually leased from the Jennings Artesian Farmlands Company to complete the bombing target. A June 1948 report stated that the Bell Range was to be used until the completion of 2 nearby ranges at Camp Landing, thus making the Bell Range hugely important for training pilots at NAS Jax and Cecil Field. Munitions used at the site were mostly practice bombs ranging from 3 to 100 pounds in weights. And I actually have friends who, you can still go out there and find these munitions today. Our friend Teresa just actually found one out in Oakley a couple weeks ago and had to get the JSO bomb squad involved. Only a year after the Bell Target being open, a tragedy did strike. Frankie Scryer of Pennsylvania was training as a dive bomber pilot at Cecil Field in 1944. As his plane was making an approach for a normal landing, he made a fatal mistake in the dense fog and his plane crashed, killing him instantly. Parts of the plane actually remained at the bomb field in Jennings State Forest until the 1980s. So these days, it seems like development is happening down every street we turn. However, I'd like to end this presentation on a high note and summarize lands that have been conserved and preserved over the past several years in Clay County. In 2019, and these are the pictures on the bottom, in 2019, Smith Lake Preserve was acquired by the North Florida Land Trust. This almost 500-acre property is adjacent to Goldhead Branch State Parks and supports hiking trails and a segment of the Florida Trail. This property is also really cool because they have a greenhouse there that actually grows natural grasses that they use at the other North Florida Land Trust properties. And then in 2020, the Sandridge family donated almost all the acres that will make out Rideout Point Preserve. And Rideout Point Preserve is going to be about 600 acres opposite the creek of the Black Creek Ravines Conservation Area, which this is really cool because I would be hiking at Black Creek Ravines and I would look across Black Creek and I would be like, man, you know, how much longer are we going to have this view left for? Well, thankfully, the Sandridge family, they did not want their land developed, so they donated the almost 600 acres to North Florida Land Trust. There is no date available for when it will be opening to the public, but as you can see, the First Coast Expressway bisects the property. But I'm hoping since the expressway is finished in that area, they will eventually open to the public. And then between 2022 and 2023, the North Florida Land Trust, which, thank God for them, they've actually paired with Clay County for the land, for the farm and conservation lands program, and they've been like a guiding force in getting that to fruition. They bought 750 acres between the Clay County Regional Park and the intersection at 21 and 16. Later phases of the regional park will include hiking trails that connect the two properties. Also in 2022, over 100 acres were added to the Baird Conservation Area in Green Cove. And then in June 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis approved the protection and funding for a 1,700 acre conservation easement over land that stretches between Clay, Putnam, and Bradford. And this is only the beginning. With the passing of the Forest and Farms Conservation Lands Program in 2024, the county will only be adding more conservation land, hopefully, and preserving Clay's natural legacy for future generations. The end.
Good job, Megan.
And my dad actually, we're having pizza, if everybody's okay with that. I work for Pizza Hut and I love giving away free food. So my dad went to go grab some pizza, so we'll have pizza to eat after the meeting. So,
Well, thank you,
thank
Megan. Don't
you.
go.